Raymond Cole worked at Riverside Funeral Home in Fort Myers, Florida for 19 years before Hurricane Irma in September 2017 showed him that some mysteries can't be explained by floodwater and physics. He'd dealt with storm damage before, had helped recover caskets displaced by flooding, had seen what hurricanes could do to cemeteries. But he'd never seen what he saw in the Whitfield vault, a body that shouldn't have moved, shouldn't have turned, shouldn't have left scratch marks inside a casket that had been sealed tight and showed no signs of being opened. Raymond still works at Riverside, but he doesn't talk about the Whitfield case, not officially, not where the family might hear. But he told me, because some things need to be documented, even when they can't be explained. I met Raymond at a waterfront restaurant in Fort Myers Beach in October 2024. He'd agreed to meet after his shift, said he preferred talking about this outside the funeral home, away from where the work happens. He was a solid man in his early 50s, with the calm demeanor of someone who'd spent decades around death. But his hands gripped his water glass too tight as he talked. Hurricane Irma hit southwest Florida, September 10, 2017, Raymond said. Category 4, storm surge, flooding, wind damage. The whole area was devastated. Our funeral home lost power for a week, but the real problems came later, when we started assessing cemetery damage. Riverside Funeral Home managed 3 cemeteries in Lee County. All 3 had experienced flooding. Storm surge from the Caloosahatchee River had inundated low-lying areas. Some caskets had surfaced. Some vaults had shifted. It was a disaster, and Raymond's job was helping coordinate the recovery and reburial efforts. Oakwood Cemetery was the worst affected, Raymond said. It's right near the river. Older cemetery, some graves dating back to the 1800s. The floodwaters sat there for 3 days before receding. When we finally got in to assess, we found 17 displaced caskets. Some had floated up completely. Others had shifted inside their vaults. The recovery process was methodical. Document everything. Photograph everything. Identify remains. Contact families. Arrange for proper reburial. Raymond had done this work after Hurricane Charlie in 2004, knew the protocols, knew how to handle it respectfully. The Whitfield vault was in Section C, Raymond said. Higher ground didn't flood as badly as other areas, but there'd been water intrusion. We could see it. The vault had shifted slightly. Protocol required us to open it, inspect the casket, make sure everything was secure before resealing. The Whitfield vault contained 1 burial. Douglas Whitfield died June 23, 2017, age 67. Heart attack. Raymond had handled the funeral personally, had prepared Douglas, had coordinated the service, had supervised the burial. It had been less than 3 months earlier. The body would still be relatively intact. September 28, 2017, Raymond said. That's when we opened the Whitfield vault. 3 weeks after the hurricane, the water had receded. The cemetery was accessible again. I was there with 2 other funeral home staff, Marcus Perry and Lynn Rodriguez, and we had a cemetery contractor doing the excavation work. They'd pulled the vault up using standard equipment. The concrete was intact, but water-stained. They'd opened it carefully. Inside was the casket, 18-gauge steel sealed bronze finish, the kind designed to be water-resistant. And it looked fine, no visible damage, no corrosion. The seal appeared intact. But the casket had moved inside the vault. Raymond said it was at an angle, shifted to one side. That can happen with flooding. Water gets in, creates buoyancy, things shift. It's physics. We expected that. They'd photographed the casket in position, then lifted it out for closer inspection, set it on the grass beside the vault. Raymond had examined the seal. It looked intact. No visible breaks. No signs of tampering or water intrusion. I told Marcus and Lynn we should open it. Raymond said, check the interior condition. Make sure Douglas's remains were still properly positioned. Make sure we didn't need to do any restoration work before resealing everything. Raymond had the key to break the seal. It was a specific tool funeral directors use, designed to crack the seal without damaging the casket. He'd positioned it, applied pressure. The seal broke with that familiar pop. Then he'd lifted the lid, and I knew immediately something was wrong, Raymond said quietly. The positioning was wrong. Everything was wrong. Raymond had placed Douglas Whitfield on his back, standard positioning, hands folded on his abdomen, face up, wearing his suit, looking peaceful. That's how Douglas had been when they'd sealed the casket in June. That's how he should have looked in September. But Douglas was face down, Raymond said, completely face down. His body had turned over. His face was pressed against the casket pillow. His arms were underneath him, and his legs, his knees were bent, like he'd been trying to push himself up. Marcus had stepped back, said something in Spanish that Raymond didn't catch. Lynn had put her hand over her mouth. The cemetery contractor had started making phone calls, and Raymond had just stood there, staring at Douglas Whitfield's body in an impossible position. I tried to rationalize it, Raymond said. Told myself maybe the flooding had caused it. Maybe water had gotten in somehow, created buoyancy, caused the body to shift. But the casket interior was dry, completely dry. No water, no moisture. The seal had been intact. Raymond had examined the body more closely. The suit Douglas was wearing showed no signs of water damage. The casket lining, the white crepe interior, was pristine, dry. If water had gotten in, if flooding had caused the body to move, there would be evidence. But there wasn't. Then Lynn pointed at the casket lid, Raymond said, at the interior, and that's when we saw them. Scratch marks. The marks were faint but visible. 4 parallel lines, multiple sets, concentrated near where the head would be if Douglas were lying face up in his original position. The white crepe lining was torn in places, and underneath, on the metal itself, were scratches, superficial but real. I looked at Douglas's hands, Raymond said. They were underneath him, bent at awkward angles, but I could see the fingernails. They were intact, clean, no damage, no signs of scratching, no fabric or metal fragments, nothing that would indicate he'd made those marks. Raymond had called his supervisor immediately, explained the situation. The supervisor had arrived within 30 minutes with the funeral home owner. They'd examined everything, photographed everything, and they'd called the medical examiner. Dr. Sandra Lopez arrived around 2 p.m., so Raymond said. She examined the body in situ, checked for signs of trauma, checked the fingernails, checked everything, and she couldn't explain it. Dr. Lopez had documented the body position, had noted the scratch marks, had examined the seal integrity, and her conclusion was that this was unexplained post-burial body displacement with no clear mechanism. She ruled out foul play, Raymond said. The vault had been sealed. The casket seal had been intact until we broke it. No evidence anyone had opened it after burial. No signs of tampering. So how did Douglas end up face down? How did those scratch marks get there? They'd called the Whitfield family. Douglas's widow, Susan, had come to the cemetery. Raymond had explained the situation as carefully as he could, told her they'd found the casket displaced by flooding and that Douglas's body had shifted. Didn't mention face down. Didn't mention scratch marks. Just said they needed to do repositioning and restoration before reburial. Susan asked to see him. Raymond said. I tried to discourage it, told her the body had been disturbed, that it might be upsetting, but she insisted. So I let her look, and when she saw Douglas face down, she gasped, started crying, said he was claustrophobic, he was terrified of being buried. I shouldn't have done closed casket. I should have cremated him like he wanted. That was the first Raymond had heard about claustrophobia, about Douglas's fear of being buried. Susan explained that Douglas had panic attacks in enclosed spaces, had made her promise, years earlier, that when he died, he'd be cremated. But when the time came, Susan couldn't do it. Her faith didn't approve of cremation. She'd chosen burial instead, had chosen a sealed casket, had done exactly what Douglas feared most. Susan looked at those scratch marks. Raymond said. And she said, "He woke up. He tried to get out. Oh my God. He woke up, and I'd buried him." Raymond and Dr. Lopez had both assured her that wasn't possible, that Douglas had been pronounced dead at the hospital, that Raymond himself had prepared the body, had verified death through standard funeral home procedures, that modern medicine didn't make those mistakes, that it was physically impossible for Douglas to have been alive. But Susan wouldn't accept it, Raymond said. She kept saying, "Then how did he turn over? How did those marks get there?" And we didn't have answers. We still don't. Dr. Lopez had performed a limited examination, confirmed that Douglas's condition was consistent with being deceased for 3 months. Advanced decomposition, no signs of recent trauma. The positioning was impossible, but the body itself showed Douglas had been dead since June. "We repositioned him," Raymond said. "Carefully, respectfully. Put him back the way he should have been. Face up, hands folded. We replaced the torn lining where the scratch marks were, made everything look proper again. Then we resealed the casket and reburied him." But Raymond couldn't let it go. He'd researched everything he could find about post-mortem body movement, found cases of coffin birth, where decomposition gases cause movement, found documentation of bodies shifting due to muscle relaxation or gas buildup. But nothing explained a complete body rotation. Nothing explained scratch marks when the fingernails showed no damage. "I talked to other funeral directors," Raymond said, "older guys with decades of experience. Asked if they'd ever seen anything like it. Most said no, but one director man, who'd been in the business for 50 years, he told me a story. The director had worked in New Orleans in the 1970s, had opened a vault after flooding from a tropical storm, found a body that had turned sideways in the casket. The man had been claustrophobic in life, terrified of burial. His family had insisted on it anyway, and when they opened the casket after the flood, he'd shifted, turned, like he'd been trying to find a way out. The old director said some bodies remember. Raymond said, remember what the person feared, remember what they fought against, and under certain conditions, flooding, storms, disturbances, that fear manifests physically. The body moves in ways it shouldn't, tries to escape even though the person is long dead. Raymond didn't know if he believed that. Didn't know if he believed bodies could carry consciousness, could remember fear, could move with intention, but he couldn't explain the Whitfield case any other way. "I've opened hundreds of caskets," Raymond said. "After floods, after vault failures, after family requests, and I've never seen anything else like Douglas Whitfield. Bodies shift, sure, settle, move slightly, but complete rotation, face down, with scratch marks. That doesn't happen naturally." Raymond had kept copies of the photographs, against protocol, but he'd done it anyway. He'd shown them to me on his phone. Douglas face down in the casket. The scratch marks on the lid interior, the bent knees, the positioned arms underneath the body. Susan Whitfield had Douglas disinterred and cremated 6 months later, Raymond said. Said she couldn't leave him buried. Couldn't stop thinking about him face down, about those scratch marks, about his claustrophobia. She had him cremated and scattered his ashes in the Gulf, said that's what he'd wanted. What she should have done in the first place. Raymond had handled that disinterment too, had opened the casket one final time. Douglas was still face up, the way they'd repositioned him, peaceful. But Raymond couldn't shake the memory of how they'd found him the first time. Turned over, face pressed into the pillow, knees bent. "You want to know what I believe?" Raymond said. "I believe Douglas Whitfield's fear didn't end with his death. I believe his claustrophobia, his terror of being buried, was so intense that some part of it persisted. And when the hurricane flooded the cemetery, when conditions changed, when everything was disrupted, that fear acted. The body moved, tried to turn, tried to escape. He put his phone away. Outside, the Florida sunset painted the sky orange and pink. Tourists walked past. Normal people with normal concerns. "The scratch marks are what I can't explain," Raymond said. "If it was just gas buildup, just decomposition causing movement, there wouldn't be scratch marks. Those marks were deliberate, repeated. Someone, something, clawed at that lid. But Douglas's fingernails were clean, undamaged. So what made those marks?" Raymond stood up, preparing to leave for his evening shift. More funerals to coordinate, more families to comfort, more bodies to prepare with the care and respect they deserved. "I still prepare claustrophobic people for burial," Raymond said. "Family requests it, and I do my job. But now I always tell families about cremation. Tell them it's an option. Tell them that if their loved one had any fears about burial, any anxieties about being underground, maybe cremation is better. Because I don't know what happened to Douglas Whitfield, but I know he ended up face down in a sealed casket with scratch marks on the lid. And that's not natural. That's not explainable, and I never want to see it again." Raymond Cole walked back to his car, heading to Riverside Funeral Home for another night of serving the dead and comforting the living. And I sat there thinking about Douglas Whitfield, about a man with claustrophobia buried against his wishes, about a body found face down after a hurricane, about scratch marks that shouldn't exist. The rational explanation is physics and decomposition, gas buildup, causing movement, flooding, creating conditions that shifted the body, scratch marks from something other than human nails, debris, metal fragments, something that got into the casket somehow, despite the intact seal. But Raymond saw that body, saw the positioning, saw scratch marks that appeared deliberate, repeated, desperate. Maybe Douglas Whitfield's fear was so intense it survived death. Maybe claustrophobia doesn't end when your heart stops. Maybe when you bury someone who's terrified of being buried, some part of them never stops trying to get out. And maybe, during a hurricane, during flooding, during chaos, when the normal rules of physics are disrupted, that terror finds a way to manifest, finds a way to turn the body, finds a way to scratch at the lid, finds a way to show us what we should have known. That death doesn't conquer fear. Sometimes, fear survives. And the body remembers, even when it shouldn't be able to move, even when the casket is sealed, even when every rational explanation says it's impossible. The body remembers and tries to escape one last time. Margaret Chen worked as a funeral director in San Francisco, California for 28 years before the exhumation in August 1994 showed her that some grief carries truths we're not supposed to find. She'd relocated remains before, had opened countless caskets containing infants and children, had handled the delicate work of moving tiny bodies with the reverence they deserved. But she'd never opened a casket and found it empty. Never seen burial records that documented a body that wasn't there. Never watched an elderly mother weep and say words that explained nothing and everything. Margaret retired in 2010, moved to a quiet neighborhood in Oakland. But she's never forgotten the Campbell twins. Never stopped wondering what really happened in 1957. Never stopped thinking about that empty casket. I met Margaret at her home in Oakland in November 2024. She'd agreed to talk after I'd spent months tracking down people involved in the case. She was 78 now, her hands showing the tremor of age, but her memory was sharp. She served tea and we sat in her living room, surrounded by photographs of the hundreds of families she'd served. And she told me about the day they opened the caskets of Rose and Lily Campbell. "The Campbell family contacted me in July 1994, Margaret said, holding her teacup with both hands. Their mother, Dorothy Campbell, was dying, cancer. She had weeks, maybe a month, and she'd made a request. She wanted her twin daughters, who died at birth in 1957, exhumed and reburied in the family plot at Cypress Lawn Cemetery. Wanted them beside her and her late husband. Wanted the family together. Dorothy Campbell was 81 years old. She'd been 23 when she gave birth to twins in July 1957. Both girls had been stillborn, delivered at 32 weeks, a tragedy that had haunted Dorothy her entire life. She'd named them Rose and Lily, had buried them at Holy Cross Cemetery in Colma, had visited their graves every year for 37 years. Dorothy's son, Robert, handled the arrangements. Margaret said he was in his 50s, Dorothy's only surviving child. He explained his mother's situation, her last wishes. Said the twins had been buried in simple caskets, side by side at Holy Cross. He had the burial records, the plot numbers, everything was documented. Margaret had coordinated hundreds of disinterments. The process was straightforward. Get court approval, file the proper permits, contact both cemeteries, arrange transportation for infant remains. After 37 years, she expected very little, possibly some bones, possibly nothing. Infant caskets from the 1950s weren't built to last. The bodies would have decomposed completely. August 16, 1994, Margaret said, that's when we did the disinterment. Early morning before the cemetery opened to visitors, I was there with Robert Campbell, his wife, and Dorothy. Despite her condition, she'd insisted on being present. She wanted to see her daughters one last time. The crew at Holy Cross had located the graves using the plot records, side by side, just as documented. Two small markers, simple granite. Rose Campbell, July 12, 1957, and Lily Campbell, July 12, 1957. The graves were in the infant section, surrounded by dozens of other tiny markers. We excavated carefully, Margaret said. Infant caskets are small, fragile. We pulled up the first one, Rose's casket, according to the burial map. It was in poor condition. The wood had deteriorated badly, but it was intact enough to recognize as a casket. We set it carefully on the grass. Then they'd excavated the second plot, Lily's grave. The casket came up in similar condition, weathered, deteriorating, but intact. Both caskets were transported to Margaret's funeral home for opening and examination before transport to Cypress Lawn. We opened them in our preparation room, Margaret said. Private, just Robert and me. Dorothy was too frail to be present for this part. We document what we found, then allow the family to pay respects before reburial. Margaret had opened Rose's casket first. Inside was what she'd expected. Infant remains, bones mostly. The tiny skeleton was largely intact. The burial gown had deteriorated, but was still partially present. There was also a small blanket, a silver nameplate that read Rose, and a crucifix. Everything consistent with a 1957 infant burial. Then we opened Lily's casket, Margaret said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. Not empty of everything. The nameplate was there, Lily engraved in silver. A blanket was there, folded neatly, but no body, no bones, no remains of any kind. Just an empty casket with the blanket and nameplate. I stood there staring, Margaret said. Robert was beside me. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then Robert said, "Where is she? Where's my sister?" Margaret had examined the casket carefully, looked for any signs of disturbance. The casket had been sealed, not with modern seals, but with the methods used in the 1950s. The seal showed no signs of being broken and resealed. The wood deterioration was consistent throughout. There was no evidence the casket had been opened since burial. I checked the nameplate 3 times, Margaret said. Made sure we had the right casket. Lily Campbell, July 12, 1957. This was definitely the casket that had been buried in Lily's plot, but there was no body inside. Margaret had called the cemetery immediately. Explained the situation. The cemetery superintendent had arrived within an hour. He'd brought the original burial records. Both showed clear documentation. Rose Campbell and Lily Campbell, buried July 15, 1957. side by side. Plot numbers matched. Everything matched. Except one casket was empty. The superintendent was defensive. Margaret said. Said this was impossible. Said both infants had been buried properly. Said there must be some mistake. But there was no mistake. Rose's remains were in her casket. Lily's casket was empty. They'd re-examined Lily's gravesite, checked the surrounding ground, looked for any signs of previous disturbance or exhumation. Nothing. The graves had been undisturbed since 1957. The cemetery records showed no notations about any issues, no documentation of any problems. Robert insisted we tell his mother, Margaret said. I tried to discourage it. Dorothy was dying. Why burden her with this mystery? But Robert said she had a right to know, so we told her. Dorothy Campbell had been in bed at home, too weak to move. Margaret and Robert had gone to her house, sat beside her bed, explained what they'd found. Rose's remains were there. Lily's casket was empty. Dorothy didn't look surprised. Margaret said. She just started crying, quiet tears, and she said, I always felt one of them was still alive. Always. But they told me both babies were born dead. They told me there was nothing they could do. Robert had tried to comfort his mother, told her it must be some mistake, some administrative error. But Dorothy shook her head. She wanted to tell them something. Something she'd never told anyone. Something about the twins' birth. Dorothy said the delivery had been complicated. Margaret said she'd been at St. Mary's Hospital in San Francisco. It was 1957. Different medical practices, different protocols. The babies had been premature. She'd heard one cry. She was certain. She'd heard one of the twins cry. But the doctor had told her. Both were stillborn. Had told her husband, James. The same thing. Both babies dead. Nothing could be done. Dorothy had been sedated after the delivery. Standard practice in 1957. She'd been unconscious for hours. When she woke up, James told her the babies had been taken care of. Arrangements made. She'd never seen either infant, never held them. The hospital's policy was that stillborn babies weren't shown to mothers. Thought it was too traumatic. Dorothy said she'd asked James if he was sure they were both dead. Margaret said. Asked if he'd seen them. James said yes. The doctor had shown him. Both babies had been stillborn. But Dorothy never believed it. Said she'd heard that cry. Knew one baby had been alive. But everyone told her she was wrong. Told her she'd been confused, medicated, grief-stricken. Eventually she stopped arguing. But she never stopped believing. Robert had been stunned. His father James had died in 1982. Couldn't be asked about this now. The hospital records from 1957 were likely destroyed or inaccessible. There was no way to verify what had actually happened. But Margaret had an idea. Margaret said, speaking of herself in third person, the way she'd done throughout the story, when things got difficult. She suggested they contact St. Mary's Hospital, see if any records remained, see if there was any documentation of the birth. Robert had made calls. St. Mary's Hospital still existed, but had been through multiple renovations and ownership changes. Their records department searched, found nothing from 1957. Too old. Too much time had passed. The records had been destroyed decades ago according to retention policies. Then Robert found something else. Margaret said. He'd been going through his father's belongings, things stored in the attic, and he found a letter, dated August 1957, 1 month after the twins were born, addressed to James Campbell from St. Mary's Hospital. The letter was brief, formal. It thanked James for his understanding regarding the difficult situation and confirmed that arrangements had been made as discussed. It was signed by the hospital administrator and a doctor whose signature was illegible. Robert showed me that letter, Margaret said, and I felt cold reading it. Arrangements had been made as discussed. What arrangements? What difficult situation? That letter suggested something had been agreed to, something beyond just burial of stillborn infants. Margaret had researched 1957 adoption practices, found that in that era, particularly for premature or ill infants, hospitals sometimes facilitated private adoptions, sometimes without full disclosure to birth parents, especially if the parents were young, unmarried, or considered unable to care for a sick child. It was illegal, but it happened. Dorothy Campbell had been 23, Margaret said. James had been 25, working class, Catholic. They already had a 1-year-old son. When the twins came early, when one was healthy enough to survive, and one wasn't, maybe the hospital made a decision. Maybe they told James one baby could survive, but would need extensive care. Maybe they suggested adoption. Maybe James agreed, thinking it was best. Maybe they told Dorothy both were dead to make it easier. It was speculation. Unprovable, but it explained the empty casket. Explained Dorothy's insistence that she'd heard a cry. Explained that letter about arrangements. Robert tried to investigate, Margaret said. Contacted adoption agencies. Tried to find records. But 1957 adoptions, especially private or hospital-facilitated ones, were often sealed or poorly documented. Without knowing which baby survived, Rose or Lily, without knowing which family adopted her, there was no way to search. Dorothy Campbell died 3 weeks after the exhumation. Robert had Rose's remains reburied at Cypress Lawn beside where Dorothy would soon be buried. Lily's empty casket was buried there too. All the family together except for the one who might still be alive somewhere. I attended Dorothy's funeral, Margaret said. She'd requested I coordinate it. And at the service, Robert spoke about his mother's grief, about the twins she'd lost, about how she'd visited their graves every year for 37 years, about how she'd always felt one of them was still alive. And he said, "If Lily is out there somewhere, if she's alive, I hope she had a good life. I hope she was loved. I hope someday we'll meet." Margaret had kept copies of the documentation, the burial records showing both twins interred, the exhumation permits, the photographs of Rose's remains and Lily's empty casket. She'd filed everything carefully. Knew this was an unusual case, knew it might need to be referenced someday. "Over the years, I've wondered," Margaret said. "Wondered if Lily Campbell is alive. She'd be 67 now. Probably doesn't know she's adopted. Probably thinks her birth date is different. Probably has no idea she had a twin sister. Has no idea her birth mother visited an empty grave for 37 years. Margaret had researched similar cases. Found documentation of other hospital-facilitated adoptions in the 1950s and 1960s. Found cases where parents were told their babies died when actually they'd been adopted out. It wasn't common, but it happened, especially with premature twins where one was healthy and one wasn't. "The ethical violations are enormous," Margaret said. Lying to parents, falsifying death certificates, burying empty caskets. But in 1957, hospitals had enormous power. Parents trusted doctors absolutely. If a doctor said your baby was dead, you believed it. You didn't demand to see the body. You didn't question. Margaret had contacted Robert several times over the years. He'd done DNA testing, uploaded his profile to ancestry databases, hoped that maybe Lily would do the same. Maybe she'd get curious about her heritage. Maybe she'd search for biological family. But so far nothing, no matches, no contact. "Robert is 71 now," Margaret said. "Still hoping, still wondering if his sister is out there. But time is running out. If Lily is alive, if she's going to learn the truth, it needs to happen soon." Margaret stood up, walked to a filing cabinet, pulled out a folder. Inside were the photographs from the exhumation. Rose's tiny skeleton, Lily's empty casket with its nameplate and folded blanket, the documentation proving both babies had supposedly been buried. "I've kept these for 30 years, Margaret said, waiting for someone to ask. Waiting for Lily to come looking, because if she ever does, If she ever finds out she was adopted and starts searching for her birth family, she needs to know. Needs to know her mother never forgot her, never stopped visiting her grave, never stopped believing she was alive. Margaret closed the folder, put it back carefully. "You want to know what I believe?" Margaret said. "I believe Dorothy Campbell was right. I believe she heard that cry. I believe one twin survived. I believe James made an impossible decision. Agreed to let the healthy baby be adopted, knowing he couldn't afford the medical care she'd need, knowing it was best for her. And I believe Dorothy never forgave him for it, even though she never knew for sure." She walked me to the door. Outside, Oakland's afternoon sun was warm. Normal life continuing. People who had no idea what secrets were buried in cemeteries. "Empty caskets aren't supposed to exist," Margaret said. "When we bury someone, there should be a body. But I've learned that sometimes the absence is the evidence. Sometimes what's missing tells the story more clearly than what's there." Margaret Chen closed the door, and I walked to my car, thinking about Rose and Lily Campbell, about twin sisters. One buried in a casket with her tiny bones, one who was never there at all, one who might still be alive, 67 years old, with no idea she had a twin who died and a mother who mourned them both. The rational explanation is administrative error, records mixed up, a casket buried in the wrong plot, documentation mistakes from 1957 that can't be verified now. But Margaret saw that letter, saw those words. Arrangements had been made as discussed, and she saw Dorothy's face when she heard about the empty casket. Saw recognition, not surprise. Saw confirmation, not shock. Maybe Lily Campbell is alive. Maybe she was adopted by a family who gave her a good life. Maybe she's a grandmother now. Has no idea about her origins, has never wondered why she doesn't look like her parents. Maybe she'll never know. Or maybe, someday, she'll submit her DNA to an ancestry site, and she'll get a match to Robert Campbell, and she'll learn that she had a twin sister named Rose, and a mother named Dorothy, who visited an empty grave for 37 years, who always knew, who always believed, who was right all along. Because mothers know. Even when everyone tells them they're wrong, even when the doctors and the death certificates and the burial records all say otherwise. Mothers know, and Dorothy Campbell knew she'd heard that cry, knew one of her babies was alive. Spent 37 years visiting a grave that held a casket with just a blanket and a nameplate, waiting for the truth to come out. And it did. 37 years too late for Dorothy. But maybe not too late for Lily. If she's still out there, if she ever finds out, if she ever comes looking for the family she never knew she had. Because empty caskets tell stories too. They just tell them in silence.